In early 2021, Mercedes-Benz announced their new flagship electric sedan called the X. This was supposed to be the Tesla killer. It was fully electric, highly luxurious, and came in at the same price range as the Tesla Model S and the S Plaid. To Mercedes' credit, the inside truly looked insane. It was like a white snow fantasy with beautiful stitching patterns and elegant wood. There were a few gimmicks like the Hyper screen, which they like to say is a 56-inch display when really, it's just 3 smaller displays under the same piece of glass. The LED lighting may have also been a bit over the top, but for the most part, the interior was very fitting for carrying the S-Class name. And then, there was the exterior. There was really no way to put it other than, was ugly. In an effort to reduce drag and increase aerodynamics as much as possible, Mercedes threw design appeal completely out the window and focused purely on aerodynamics. And here's the thing, when someone is spending over $100,000 on a luxury sedan, they very much care about how it looks, not just its fuel efficiency. In fact, fuel efficiency is probably the last thing they care about. Unsurprisingly, X sales were terrible. In 2022, they only sold a total of 23,400 X sedans, and in 2023, they only sold 14,100 X sedans. If you were one of the few people who bought this sedan, you got annihilated by depreciation. Everyone knows that luxury cars depreciate fast, but the X was unlike anything we've ever seen before. Within just the first year, the car fell by 47.8%, meaning you were able to find X selling for less than $50,000. For perspective, that's only $13,000 more than a maxed-out Toyota Camry for an S-Class. Needless to say, the X was the biggest flop of recent times for Mercedes. The struggle to transition to electric has left the company stagnant. Their revenue is at the same place it was 10 years ago. Their stock hasn't done anything in the past 7 years, and most importantly, they're tarnishing the Mercedes name with plain ugly vehicles. Things are so bad that Mercedes is completely ditching the EQ lineup. So, here's the full story of Mercedes' EV disaster. If you're interested in deeper dives, interviews with insiders, and exclusive tech analysis, consider subscribing to our free weekly newsletter. But anyway, taking a look back, the story of Mercedes' EV woes can be traced back to the retirement of Dieter Zetsche. Zetsche was the iconic CEO with the big mustache that made Mercedes into the modern status symbol that it is. He was with Daimler since 1976 and became CEO in 2006, right before the 2008 financial crisis. His first course of action was getting rid of a toxic asset, Chrysler, which for some reason they used to own. To give you more context as to just how poorly Chrysler was performing, well, they would go bankrupt just days after the split was finalized. So, almost immediately Zetsche went down as the guy who finally freed Mercedes from Chrysler. But this was just his first grand move. He would go on to navigate Mercedes through the 2008 financial crisis and overtake BMW as the best-selling premium carmaker in 2016. So, needless to say, Zetsche was a shareholder favorite. But after spending over 40 years at Mercedes or Daimler, Zetsche decided to retire, leading us to a new CEO in 2019, Ola Källenius. Ola was no stranger to Mercedes. He had been around since his 20s in the early 1990s, but his upcoming task was unlike anything he had ever worked with. You see, in late 2019, Tesla announced the Cybertruck, which garnered an unprecedented number of pre-orders and kicked off the 2020-2021 EV boom. EV startups like Rivian and Lucid boomed. In fact, at one point, Rivian was worth over $150 billion, which is double what Mercedes is currently worth. Needless to say, Ola had an insane amount of pressure to not only prove himself as the new CEO, but also make Mercedes relevant in the booming EV landscape. So, he looked at what all the EV startups were doing. They were not only electrifying vehicles, but also modernizing vehicles. A lot of them didn't have on-off buttons, for example. They also had super over-engineered door handles, and everything in the car had to be controlled using the big iPad in the middle, including simple things like positioning the air vents. Likely the most noticeable aspect, however, was their bold designs. They didn't have front grills, and they strived to look modern. Rivians, for example, have that iconic light bar in the front, and Teslas have the highly divisive barebones interiors. It wasn't just these EV startups that were redesigning their cars, either. So were legacy automakers, specifically their German neighbors, Volkswagen. Keep in mind, when the Volkswagen Group makes a decision, it flows down to Volkswagen, Audi, Lamborghini, Bentley, and Porsche. Now, it should be noted that some legacy automakers like Toyota, Honda, and Nissan chose to take things slow. But as a new CEO with much to prove, Ola naturally went down the path of embracing EVs. We saw headlines like, Mercedes-Benz prepares to go all electric, and investments of 60 billion euros. With all this hype and investment, you would think that Mercedes was about to launch the next big thing, but what we got instead was the X in 2021, leading us into the EQ disaster. The X was just the beginning of the EQ disaster. Over the next few years, Mercedes would bring out EQ variants of most of their best-selling models. This included the EQBL, the EQ sedan, and the EQ SUV. All of them had smooth front bumpers and terrible egg-shaped designs. This was especially problematic with super high-end vehicles, like the Mercedes-Benz X-Maybach SUV. This was a car that started at $180,000 and looked like this. Now, don't get me wrong, not saying that there is something inherently wrong with egg-shaped vehicles. It's likely that some of you even like the design, and some automakers actually pull the design off rather well. Lucid. The Lucid Air launched with the best drag coefficient on the market, and it looks like this, not like this. The thing to keep in mind, though, is the type of person that buys cars that cost over $100,000. These people are usually not looking for the best aerodynamics or the best fuel economy. They're looking for the most badass car on the market, and frankly, this is simply not it. Mercedes should know this more than anyone else, given that they have a full sub-brand called AMG, which is known for its aggressive styling. And let's not forget the G-Wagon. The G-Wagon, like the Hummer, is known for being a big fat brick status symbol. While many people hate this about G-Wagons, G-Wagon buyers usually love it. So, it really just comes down to knowing your demographic and giving them what they want. This was something that GM actually did really well with the Hummer EV. Instead of trying to make it a fuel-efficient modern sleek EV, GM decided to make it the most brash, over-the-top brick they could. They ended up with a vehicle that's so wide that you need a special license to drive in much of Europe, weighing in at an obnoxious 9,000 pounds. Now, the Hummer EV didn't have insane top-line sales numbers because it appeals to such a niche portion of the population. But within that population, it's doing quite well. It's the same thing with the Ford F-150 Lightning. The regular Ford F-150 has been America's best-selling vehicle for 41 years, and Ford knew not to mess with that. With the Lightning, they kept everything essentially the same, other than the fact that the vehicle was now electric. The Lightning and the Hummer EV show just how well these companies understand their core demographic. The EQ lineup, on the other hand, shows just how poorly Mercedes understood theirs. For some reason, brands like Mercedes went down the path of thinking that electrification efforts had to be paired with modernization efforts. And to put it bluntly, they basically ended up with Toyota Priuses with insane interior quality and design. No wonder this didn't appeal to Mercedes buyers. Despite the early red flags, though, Mercedes kept moving forward with the EQ lineup, leading us to the electric G-Wagon, or the XEG. The G-Wagon is arguably Mercedes' most iconic vehicle, and as we previously mentioned, one of its core selling points is that it's a brash brick with terrible fuel efficiency. If you take these factors out, it's no longer a real G-Wagon. This is what Mercedes eventually came up with. It was nowhere near as bad as the X or the X-Maybach, as it still retained the essence of a G. With that being said, though, it did also come with weird quirks like the square wheel case in the back and, of course, the smooth front bumper. It wasn't clear how many AMG G63 fans would actually switch over to this electric version, but here's the good news. The original XEG was revealed way back in September of 2021, and it wasn't slated to come out until late 2024, so Mercedes had plenty of time to see the terrible reception of their other EQ vehicles and completely shift course, which is exactly what they've done. Mercedes has tried to keep the fact that they're ditching their EQ lineup as quiet as possible. For one, they don't want to admit that the EQ push was a massive failure and that they're backtracking. And two, they don't want to drive EQ vehicle prices lower than they already are. So, they're trying to quietly walk away from EQ altogether. The news originally came 3 months ago in the form of rumors from Mercedes dealers that they had been notified that the EQ branding would soon be phased out. Just a month ago, Mercedes confirmed this with how the XEG actually turned out. For starters, it's no longer even called the XEG. Instead, Mercedes is calling it the G580 with EQ technology. Also, Mercedes has completely reversed track on the styling. It's no longer going to be the futuristic silver and black. It's actually going to be regular colors like black, white, blue, gray, and a sand color. Mercedes has not only walked back EV styling, but is even offering customers the option to completely remove EV styling. For example, you know the flat grille section? Well, it can apparently be spec'd to have a regular looking grille and front bumper. Also, you know the weird square wheel case? Well, it can be spec'd to be a regular circular wheel case with an actual spare wheel. Mercedes is basically offering customers the option to buy a regular G550 that just happens to be electric. The feedback so far seems to be much more reassuring. Now do this with all the other cars in the lineup. I hate the Jelly Bean life. Definitely a smart move. Will lower their emissions by a bunch, and most new G-Wagon owners aren't off-roading them, so the range won't matter. If they stop selling the gas ones completely, it might harm them long-term, but I don't think it's really an issue. What's even more indicative is that the few negative comments we're still seeing have to do with the XEG remnant, specifically the front and the square wheel case. The front looks like the Comic Sans of car grills. It bothers me the rear spare tire or wheel is just for show and actually a charger. Mercedes executives have also confirmed that they are taking feedback about egg-shaped styling very seriously. This is probably why they're doing a facelift for the X that brings back the raised star and a fake front grille. Looking forward though, they still have a long way to go when it comes to electrifying their entire fleet in a tasteful manner. Mercedes is aiming to bring out a more traditional replacement for the X in 2028. So EQ vehicles will probably be around for the rest of the decade, but at least Mercedes is acknowledging their missteps and trying to make things right. That is what happened with the Mercedes-Benz EQ disaster. Are you a fan of modern egg-shaped car designs? Comment that down below. See you next time.